Okay. So I'm here with Ben Smith, a friend and a professor of history at Warwick University and an expert in Mexican history. Ben, you've written, this is the fourth book. You've written 4 books?
Yes, three completely unread and one marginally read by yourself. And maybe a couple of...
How do you know I marginally read it? I fully read it.
Okay, fair enough.
So your latest book is The Dope, and it's a history of drugs in Mexico going back to the late 19th century all the way to the present day. So first of all, and I loved it, and I read it fully, not marginally, this week. So this is my first thought when reading it was, this is daunting. How do you research a century of drugs when I guess a lot of it, how do you find sources and material on it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, with some difficulty, I suppose. So first of all, I was relying on a group of historians who over the last 2 decades or so have been attempting to kind of do research on this kind of thing. Some successfully. There's a brilliant guy called Isaac Campos who's dealt with a lot of the mythology over marijuana. I rely on a lot for the first couple of chapters. There's a guy called Luis Astorga, who's a big sociologist, not a historian, but he's tracked down quite a lot of kind of the histories on this that's found in the archives. But principally, I suppose, not to get too technical about this, but there are effectively 2 places that I got most information from. One was the American drug agents. So first called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, run by a slightly crazy man called Harry Anslinger, then the DEA. So I got quite a lot of information from them, not all of it entirely true, I suspect, and I had to triangulate a lot of that kind of stuff. The second was Mexico since 2000 has, compared to Britain or the United States, has a remarkably transparent spy archive. So it had basically, I had access to their versions of the FBI and the CIA. And they kept tabs on drug dealers, they kept tabs on corrupt police officers, they kept tabs on corrupt governors, and that was an extraordinary source. And I then basically supplemented that with interviews, which I know both of us started off as journalists, and you are here interviewing me, but I'm a truly appalling journalist and a dreadful interview. So that took some kind of effort, really.
And so I just think you must have a kind of mind that can absorb and synthesize massive amounts of information, and like you obviously love kind of archive research as well, right? And you said that there are the big federal archives, and then there's little state archives which are scorpion infested. Was this a personal experience? So beyond the big archives, again, we're getting to the kind of technical stuff here. So also, the one thing that I did find, I think no one else had really used before, is judicial archives. So effectively, Mexico put away a lot of drug traffickers. It had per capita, it's putting away more drug traffickers than America, even in the 40s and 50s. And there were just extraordinary detailed judicial reports of police stings, often hand in hand with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, taking down these drug dealers. Now, you had to take these with a bit of a pinch of salt. Certainly since the 1960s, they were torturing. They did a lot of basically torturing confessions out of people. So it's unclear quite how true some of this stuff is. But basically, those kind of archives were tiny, dusty, difficult to get into, depended entirely on a personal relationship with the archivist. I was really helped by a friend that I know a guy called Nat Morris, who was an extraordinary kind of research assistant and a great historian in his own right. So he did actually a lot of the legwork on this, and I just kind of turned up so I could put it in the introduction and pretend I was like Indiana Jones of drugs. Is it dangerous for you to write about this topic?
So I was made quite a deliberate decision that, so 100, I'm sure some of your people might know this, but 150 journalists have been killed in the last 20 years investigating the drug trade.
However, two things. One, none of them have been foreign, to my knowledge, because basically, if you kill a foreign journalist, you're actually likely to be caught. Whereas the people who've murdered these 150 Mexicans, none of them have been caught. About two, I think. Secondly, I made quite a conscious decision not really to investigate anything novel in the last 20 years. Some things I kind of heard about, but I would never publish them really. Having said all that, I did, and I've been quite wary about talking about this, but I've revealed it over the last kind of couple of months. I don't know if I'm somewhat kind of suffering from PTSD from it, but in about in 2018, I was in Culiacan with a colleague of mine, and we were working with this extremely generous, kind academic who was kind of helping us around the archives, but also introducing us to people kind of on the edges of the trade. And one evening, his parents just turned up at the hotel, and just weeping in tears, claiming he'd been taken and they didn't know where he was. Now he was fine. He slightly unclear quite what happened, but I think basically people were asking whether we were DEA agents. I think they just didn't know who the fuck we were. And as a result, we had to, I got in touch with Warwick University. I found out that Warwick University have an armed response unit, somewhat inevitably full of.
Is this for their? Okay, this is for their annual ref submission, is it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know quite where it was born.
Wow.
They were exactly how you might expect. They were South African mercenaries who were offering like a helicopter out of there. They were asking whether the residential zone that I was kind of staying in with a friend had a kind of helicopter landing pad, whether the armed guards outside the residential area might shoot at them. So that was all just a bit just weird.
Classic academic fare, basically.
Yeah, it's just, you know, then I got back to some marking and some quite tedious administration. No, so basically I was taken care of by this extremely kind, generous family who put us up for the night. And then basically they were saying, oh, don't worry, nothing will happen. It's fine. This is all cool. Because basically after the person was taken, he then went to a bar and got pissed and didn't contact us. So as a result, we didn't really find out what had happened to him. So we left the next morning, and I realized quite how worried they were when the brother was driving at about 140 miles an hour down the motorway to the airport. And I realized that he was probably, somewhat concerned.
Wow. So can you hear me okay? Ben? You just froze for a sec. Can you hear me okay? Running. Okay. So I guess, you know, so much has been kind of written on narco culture, including like, you know, pop culture. There's the whole industry of narco novellas, narco corridas, the ballads. And then I would say probably most like British and American people know what they know about the drugs business in Latin America. It comes from like Narcos, comes from maybe Cormac McCarthy books, comes from Sicario, these kinds of things, right? And they propagate myths. I mean, first of all, to what extent did you kind of look at that? I mean, I suppose that's a whole other thing, really, kind of cultural criticism, though to some extent it does shape actual policy and how people behave as well. But did you look at that as well, the world of kind of narco culture?
Yeah, basically. So narco culture emerges. I mean, it's a fascinating topic and a really good question. So narco culture emerges in the 1970s, effectively because the state-controlled media simply doesn't cover what's going on. So during the 1970s, the Mexican and the US government basically do a pretty violent campaign against drug growers and drug dealers. And effectively, the state doesn't cover it, basically covers it up, and it particularly covers up the elements that the US is actually involved in a lot of the kind of torture and a lot of the spraying of the fields, etc. So narco culture emerges as basically not dissimilar to parts of hip hop as a kind of alternative voice to say what is actually happening on the street or on the mountains. So I really immersed myself in that kind of stuff, partly because it was telling a tale that just wasn't, that you could only find by declassifying documents or harassing DEA agents or policemen, right, or talking to peasants that have been tortured, right? So I felt that was really important. Clearly now narco culture has become much greater than simply a kind of counter voice to the kind of the mass media.
It's a kind of global commodity.
It's a global commodity, but it's a global commodity that is devoured by people involved in the industry and shapes the way they behave, which is something that we know from example from hip hop. We know that, I've been in quite a few kind of narco or people who are not even that involved in the drug trade, and all of them will have a Scarface picture right on the wall, right? And even though Scarface is a brilliant critique of kind of, and basically it's a critique of American capitalism, but they love it, right? They kind of love it ironically, necessarily. So a lot of this culture is taken in by people, particularly at the kind of low levels. So a lot of it propagates this
culture of excess, ostentation.
So it's two things, I think, that really kind of draw people to it. One is there's a Mexican expression like mejor 10 años como rey que 40 años como buey, right? So better 10 years as a king than 40 years as an oxen, right? So basically get rich quick or die trying. Not dissimilar to that idea. The second, frankly, is it propagates a very traditional idea of masculinity, right? So one thing that's happening in Mexico, it's happening in a lot of the developing world, it's happened or happening still in the UK, is that women are getting into the workplace, women are gaining more power, gaining more visibility, gaining politics, and this is at the same time traditional male breadwinning jobs in massive big industry have effectively disappeared. So as a result, masculinity is under threat, and narco culture is a kind of one of those spaces in which you can be a man, right? You can make money.
Right.
So there's this brilliant woman who I admire, Shayla Wellman, and I probably butchered her name brutally, but she spent she'd interview her. She spent, I don't know, like 10 years up in Baja California, basically in a kind of place where they kind of traffic drugs around, and really delves deep into how this kind of ties in with traditional ideas of masculinity, which is something that, I don't know if you've been seeing this in Costa Rica, but it's, the rate of femicide in Mexico is now, because this is linked up to violence against women, and the rate of femicides in Mexico is kind of really extremely disturbing.
It's very high. I think in Costa Rica, certainly Costa Rica's got one of the worst rape rates in the world. That's fascinating, and I think in a way that explains some of its appeal as a global commodity. This is this fantasy playground, and certainly, I'm approaching this because I watched 3 series of Narcos on the hoof to improve my Spanish, but of course I couldn't. Then I started thinking about what it's presenting to me, and women are only wives and hookers in that world. Yep. So I want to get on some of the myths propagated by things like Narcos. Now, the first thing that struck me when I was watching it is I wondered if, of course, it's a story where the DEA are the good guys and the bad guys are these kingpins, and each series looks at the taking down of a different kingpin or cartel. Escobar, the Cali cartel, the Guadalajara cartel. And I wondered if actually it really played out like it does on the screen, or whether, the taking down of these organized crime, systems leads to a surge in violence rather than a reduction in it. So, what do you think about that? Does that what is that kingpin strategy actually what the DEA and others pursued? And did it work, or did it lead to more violence?
Right. So, the DEA, like any institution, effectively learns from both its mistakes and what it claims are its successes. So you're absolutely right. It did instill the Kingpin strategy kind of emerges somewhat organically when they take down Pablo Escobar and then take down the Cali cartel. And by the early 1990s, it's kind of written in stone. This is how we disrupt drug trafficking networks. We take down the big people at the top. As a result, we break up these networks. And the idea being that then you in some way reduce the drugs that are coming into the United States. However, what appears to happen, and historically what seems to happen over the last 30 years, they've continued with this strategy. It reached a peak during the 2010s in Mexico, where famously, I think the Mexican government took down about 130 of 140 kingpins, while homicide rates went through the roof and the price of drugs on the US street also went through the floor, basically. So effectively, what this is very, very good for the media. It's red meat for the anti-drug media, for the Trumpist media, for these people are invading our country and poisoning our kids media. But in actual fact, it's incredibly ineffective at actually bringing down addiction rates, overdose rates. It brings down the price of drugs. It also, as you very rightly say, and this is something that I've only started to kind of, and I do mention it at the end of the book, you clearly picked up on that, but it's something I kind of really want to delve into. Effectively, drug crime is a really weird crime. There is no victim, right? No one goes into a police station and says, oh, I was sold some dodgy heroin. It wasn't as good as I thought it would be. You're either dead or you don't admit it, right?
Yeah.
So as a result, it's really difficult to basically infiltrate these really closed networks. So what you effectively have to do is you need to get an informant inside. And that informant effectively splits apart the bonds of trust on which these networks are based. And as a result, this often causes enormous amounts of distrust and paranoia within the network, and they end up kind of killing each other, thinking each other is an informant, working against one another, and this divides so-called cartels against one another. So the classic example would be in 2008, 2009, Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa cartel, the biggest cartel in Mexico, consists of a whole network of people, but some of the big people are Chapo, his mate El Mayo, and a group called the Beltran Leyva brothers, right? And they're all cousins, they're all intermarried. They've been doing this shit since the 1970s together. They come from the same villages. Chapo is under pressure from the US and the Mexican government. They want him. And as a result, I think it's now pretty clear he sells out the Beltran Leyva brothers. Now, what this does, and one of them gets arrested, one of them gets murdered by the Marines in a really brutal killing, and they're then deliberately humiliating by throwing dollar bills on his fat corpse, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Really deliberately offensive. And as a result, the Beltran Leyva and the Chapo just split apart and start killing one another. Now, that is deliberately engineered by the DEA, and they get loads of arrests out of it because they keep snitching on each other.
Loads of arrests, but more street violence.
More street violence, and kind of it doesn't really seem to affect drugs, right? I mean, drugs is just an ecosystem. It's a network, it's a market network. It's not really about these people. I mean, that's another thing that I think I wanted to kind of delve into, and another maybe myth that maybe we're about to talk about, but the myth of what a cartel is. We assume a cartel is a network of drug dealers that are, there's the producer and there's the chemist and there's the middleman and then there's the trafficker and then there's the mule, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
That is absolutely correct. That is how drugs are produced and trafficked and consumed, right? The cartel, or Mexican cartel, is something very different. The Mexican cartel is like the mafia. It's an organized crime network involved in effectively charging all those people in the drug chain protection money. So all it says is we basically will tax you for protection so you don't get arrested by the police. That's what a cartel is. So they can fight one another.
So they're not kind of the business genius entrepreneur necessarily. They're more like a kind of tax parasite.
Yeah. They're more like a quasi-state organization.
Quasi-state, yeah.
Which is, I mean,
there is some differentiation between different organizations. So for example, Chapo certainly no doubt did start as one of the little pieces in, I mean, he's the tunnel specialist for the Sinaloa cartel. But by the time he becomes famous in the 2000s, he connects with some Colombian drug dealers to get cocaine in, but he's basically also involved in charging anyone in Sinaloa who wants to traffic drugs a percentage of their trade. That's his gig, right?
So this is not a totally integrated corporation. This is more like there's a diverse network of various other kinds of operations and dealers, but there's an organized extortion system.
Yeah, exactly what it is. So there are these two things going on that often do kind of slip together, right? I mean, so for example, often these people will be charging the drug traffickers to take their money through a particular place, but while they're doing that, they will also carry some of the drugs through that particular place, or they'll escort the truck that's carrying the drugs. So sometimes it's kind of difficult to differentiate the group, these two kind of organizations. But effectively what's happened in now is that they have become completely separate, and that kind of taxing extortion racket groups are now frankly not that interested in drugs. I mean, if there are drugs in the area, great, but often there aren't. So in rural Mexico, there aren't that many crack addicts, and there's not much cocaine coming in. So you're going to extort avocado farmers, lime farmers, taco stall owners, and this is sadly what is happening in. This is why Mexico has become, frankly, so violent over the last 20 years.
And so what are the implications of that then? If we're not talking about drug corporations, but rather extortion systems, what are the implications for that in terms of what Mexico or the US should do about it?
Do you know, this is, I've just been reading, I'm sure you've read this, Ministry for the Future. Have you read?
I'm reading it as well, but I got a bit bored about a third of the way through, because it does read like a policy wonk kind of, but okay, tell me about it.
Drone wars versus policy. Drone wars interspersed with strange policy papers. But there's a bit in the middle where it starts off with, I think, maybe one of the counterfactual sentences in literature, which is taxes are actually quite interesting. And I kind of think this kind of comes down to tax, right? The government has made a decision effectively not to have a huge tax base in Mexico, right? It has one of the, still to this day, despite being a fairly developed country, has an incredibly small tax base effectively. So what it needs to do is effectively increase that tax base, increase the power of the state, and as a result, kind of take away this kind of rival tax group, which are the cartels. You need honest policemen in the street. Yes, you need. I mean, they've kind of sent in the military, and I'm not sure the military is necessarily a terribly good tool to deal with this. I mean, the military is effectively has done exactly is doing now. It's making deals with the cartels, the protection rackets that it thinks will slip them a bit of money and will not brutally murder anyone who doesn't pay up. Might give them a beating. And instead, it's going after the particular cartel that it deems to be the most violent and the most dangerous, and also
That's kind of what I thought. Yeah, like try to make the trade. The trade is going to exist, so try to make it kind of organized. And that was my genius solution. But I thought that's probably what people have tried to do for the last 100 years.
Yeah, and it kind of worked up to about 1990, but basically the state is too fragmented now. I mean, there used to be just one party in Mexico. Now there are, I mean, they keep kind of changing, but there are effectively 4 parties. So they're all looking for a slice of this. And at the same time, the amount of money involved in drugs kind of went through the roof during the 1990s. And that basically disturbed the kind of power balance between the state
and the cartels. So now cartels are better armed. There are more of them than the state, right? So this is a real. So they can tax more than the state, right?
So you can think of tax as a form of force and a form of coercion and violence, and the state does not have a monopoly on that.
Yeah.
So it's about
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a brilliant guy, a sociologist called Charles Tilley, who says that all state formation effectively is one great big protection racket. I'm getting charged tax, so the state protects me. So I don't, get killed by somebody in the street. The police protect me, but also they protect my private property. The state doesn't do that in Mexico. So organized crime groups do, but they don't deal under the law, basically.
So the myth, that you touched on, is that the drugs economy is inevitably ultra violent and ultra competitive. But as it seems to be now, when you look at Mexico and you've got incredibly high homicide rate and drug related deaths, but it hasn't always been the case, has it? It became like this. It wasn't always like this. And is there any room for optimism in that? If it hasn't always been like this, it might not always be like this. But tell us a little bit about the fact that it hasn't always been like this.
Right. So effectively, I think it's important here to kind of distinguish between two elements of the drug trade. The first is trafficking. Trafficking, as you rightly say, involves cooperation and trust. Right? Because effectively you're doing something vaguely illegal. You've got to trust that when you give this person some money to grow some opium, they're not just going to do a runner. So it helps that they're a friend or a compadre, or that, you've known them for a long time. So effectively, trafficking itself always involves trust and cooperation, which is why it's often done in these family networks, right? Now, this doesn't actually tend to be terribly violent until, as I was saying, the DEA infiltrates you and starts to effectively threaten, if you get caught, you with 360 years in prison, which is what Chapo got, right?
They raise the stakes, as you say in your book, through things like, where you're not just going to get a year or two in a Mexican prison. We're going to extradite you. You're gonna rot in an American jail. Yeah.
So up to the kind of 1980s. You could still effectively, what's the point in selling out your compadre, the guy that you've grown up with, if you're just going to get 2-3 years in prison and keep your wealth? Just do your time, right? Once you're going to get 360 years in a US jail and all your money's going to be forfeited, which is another big thing, so your kids are going to die in poverty, you might as well kill your compadre and his entire family so they don't rat on you, right? So that is... So as I say, trafficking itself is not indelibly or not instinctively a violent operation. In fact, it's quite a cooperative operation. And you can see that throughout Mexican history, really up to the 1980s, it's very, very pacific. Very, very few murders are connected to drug crime. I mean, really minimal compared to fights over religion or ideology or land, particularly, right? The second thing to bear in mind, however, and this is something that's been really dealt with by American anthropologist called Philip Bourgeois, is drug selling is highly competitive and violent, because there you have, let's say you're in a city, the best example of this, I think, is The Wire, still to this day, right? So effectively, what happens in The Wire is there is a limited amount of drug dealers, so small gangs are effectively fighting for the
corners, the plazas,
the very small spaces, because there is a very limited amount of or a fairly limited amount of addicts that you can sell to, right? And that does cause a lot of violence. So what's happened in Mexico again over the last 20 years is you have the DEA caused cartels splitting apart has now mixed with the kind of street Baltimore wire corner violence in a lot of these cities. So what looks often like what is presented in the media as a cartel fight is often actually a load of corner fights where they've basically been armed by the cartels. So Juarez, which had the highest murder rate outside Baghdad in 2010 to 2011, it was a bunch of corner fights. It was a
And
bunch
this
of
is partly, I mean,
gang.
one of the things, one of the points you make in the book is that until quite recently, there was very little Mexican use of drugs. Hardly any heroin addiction, not, marijuana confined to a small bohemia. Has that changed? Is there more of a local drug consumption now?
Huge. I mean, I think it's something that Mexicans are not yet really taking as seriously as they should. But
Right.
places like Tijuana, which I think is the murder capital of the world, but also certain tourist resorts like Acapulco. I don't know if anyone's seen, but I think Puerto, Playa del Carmen just had 8 bodies dumped. I mean, that's just corner wars over drug selling, right, to tourists. Cabo San Lucas as well had a big high murder rate. Tulum. So these places are basically are being fought over by small gangs for basically sales. And these are sales to tourists, but also to now a sadly growing Mexican population of addicts and users. And when I came here 20 years ago, I was young, and I suspect I might have been looking for drugs, and I couldn't find any. Here, I'm now a middle-aged man not looking for drugs, and I can't move for stories of them, right?
No, you see it also in Costa Rica. Locals hide, just wandering the streets in beach towns and port towns. And
I mean, Mexico was the biggest drug trafficker in the world in the 1990s, and the biggest drug that was taken in Mexico was paint thinner. Now, to me, that indicates, and this is something I've never found any evidence, any direct evidence over, but is that part of the agreement between the state and the traffickers up to the 1990s was don't sell in Mexico. I really think because every other country that has trafficked drugs has gained an addict population, right? It's the same way that in the late 19th century, the biggest addicts were doctors because they were the one prescribing morphine, right? If you're near drugs, you tend to get quite a large addict population. Mexico never did, and I think that was quite deliberate.
There was a kind of an unofficial agreement.
I really do think it was.
Which is now broken down, so there's now like fair game, sell to the locals.
Pretty much, absolutely. And you get these tiny gangs in the middle of nowhere, like provincial towns. They've got no way they can get up north, right? Because they'd have to pass through 7 or 8 plazas, pay off 7 or 8 other cartels, risk their life, probably spend most of their money paying off those plazas. Why not just sell it to the local drunk?
Okay.
Right? And that's what they do.
Another myth I want to look at, and it feeds into this because we talk about the availability of guns, is the myth that the US is innocent and heroic country with kind of degenerate monsters at its borders. And that's clearly, it doesn't seem to be the case when you read the book, where it's like, what's driving this? It's the massive American demand for drugs, particularly since the 60s. So I kind of feel like this casts the hippie counterculture in another light. Like this, you say that you describe the hippie counterculture as like jet fuel for the Mexican drugs trade.
This is very much what we would call in Mexico your mero mole, right, Jules? the kind of interest in the critique or the interest in the counter. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. I think there's a book I read recently called is it Deviant Capitalism? So basically arguing that a lot of what we now think of as neoliberal capitalism is introduced actually by the hippie counterculture, which just turns up in these villages, starts throwing money around and gets, previously they produced corn for the little town down the road. Suddenly they're linked up to a globalized economy, right? You've got villages in Afghanistan that are basically producing the weed that is smoked in San Francisco. I mean, this is really crazy globalized stuff. So and it is based often on a exoticized a weird mixture of capitalism and exoticization of the foreign, which is it's kind of very much. I mean, that isn't that the modern. That is the modern disease in a way. So I think it kind of starts
on the road. On the road is a kind of Thatcherite text. Drive down to Mexico and get in touch with your soul through marijuana.
Yeah. No, I mean, have you read that? I read all of that beat stuff, and I loved that beat stuff, man. I loved it in my early 20s. I mean, I'm here because I read that stuff. Oh my God. I've read it. I've read it again for the book, and it was just shocking. I mean, there's one book, and I can't remember which one it is. It's not On the Road. On the Road is just kind of just boring. But there's one book where he basically decides he's going to hook up with a Mexican prostitute, a sex worker, and kind of basically just hangs around her, making her a kind of magnet for the police and everyone, and basically destroying her life, but in a kind of incredibly
carefree, innocent way.
Yeah.
I think I increasingly understand like drug literature, like beat literature, psychedelic literature, as a subset of narco culture. I think this is the way we should treat it, not in some kind of romantic, mystical sense, but it's just another form of narco culture.
I think that's a brilliant way to see it. No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Burroughs is, I was reading through Burroughs's letters, and he starts off effectively doing the kind of the kind of Kerouac, Ginsberg romanticizing Mexico. But then by the end, when he's not allowed to, when basically he can't pay enough money to get out of jail for killing his wife, he starts to just become like a racist Southerner. I mean, it's extraordinary how he's like, these people, they're outrageous, they're terrible people, really, really awful racial epithets and stuff like that, just because he can't get his own way. It's a very... And the toxic masculinity, it runs through narco culture and beat literature pretty well. There's an amazing book. Is it Bonnie Brenner? She's about the only female beat, because they didn't really let them in. And she goes down to Mexico, and her feckless, unpublished poet American husband sells her as a prostitute to the Veracruz authorities in return for drugs. It's fucking mad.
Yeah, that is, God.
So depressing.
So I and there is a puritanism, of course, to the American war on drugs. This just projection of we are innocent and there are these demons at our borders, and it kind of it mixes in with Christianity. I think you mentioned Harry Anslinger, this key figure in the war on drugs in the 40s, was it, or the 50s, or the 30s? Oh, can you hear me?
I am there. Yeah, hold on. Sorry, man.
That's cool.
Yeah, I think it's just the other thing I found out is that people literally tap Wi-Fi signals like by connecting some kind of dodgy signal bypasser, not by like hacking a password. They literally do it physically by hacking the line. So it's possible the neighbor.
So you got Wi-Fi parasites.
Yeah, pretty much. They do. That's why all those, in Mexico, you always see the electricity lines are all like this jumble of cables because they're all robbing electricity of each other.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. That's what people used to do with the telephone lines in the 70s, the kind of early hackers. Well, anyway, so I mean, I was just curious about there's a Mexican court case now against the US over guns. So there's this kind of flip of the script where it's always been the evil Mexicans sending drugs into the US, and now the Mexicans saying evil Americans sending kind of completely uncontrolled gun market into Mexico. And so that has been one of the factors in the escalation in violence, is it not? Like the easy availability of American guns?
Yeah, so first things first, that it is a deliberate attempt to change the narrative. I'm not entirely sure how successful it's been, but this guy, AMLO, the current president of Mexico, I think there's been a rather brilliant attempt to change the narrative. So it's not Mexican drugs killing American youths, it's your guns killing Mexican youths. And I think in Mexico, it has gained an enormous amount of traction. There is a guy who was quite high up in the Mexican administration, who did a PhD in LSE and started to trace. He did some extraordinary research, both statistical and qualitative. He was talking to hitmen, and they were explaining, in the 1990s, I had a machete, my mate had a knife, and the boss had some rusty old gun from some Central American Civil War, right? 2004, they changed the law in the United States to make its gun way more available, particularly automatic, semi-automatics. By 2005, so that's a year before basically the drug war goes absolutely ballistic, they've all tooled up. They've got 6 or 7 guns, right? Yeah. All of which are being brought down from Walmart in El Paso, right? Yeah. And so this guy, this LSE student, he managed to get data. It's really difficult to get data on gun sales, but he managed to get some data on gun sales, and he found out just before every big cartel war over Juarez or Laredo or Tijuana, there was a massive 6 months before, there's a massive bump in gun sales in the city over the border. Yeah, I mean, it's really, really noticeable. Like, again, I mean, even here down in southern Mexico, yeah, I've met quite a lot of kind of mates and stuff who've now tooled up. I mean, no one had a gun in Mexico when I came here, but it's now fairly common. Mexico has one solitary gun store, which is on a military base, and you need 8 forms of basically 8 departments to sign off on you to get a gun. Yeah, and yet it has some of the highest gun ownership in the world now, and it's all down to this US market. It really is breathtaking. And so, okay, I suppose the second thing is, okay, so we know they're bringing guns down. It's these guns that are causing the killings. So up to in the 1990s, 17% of murders were caused by firearm. Most people were macheted or knifed or strangled, right? Now it's 80% of murders. Yeah. So it's just way easier to kill people. Way easier, yeah. You can, and way more likely that random people can get shot. Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a brilliant book now out by Ewan Grillo, who you might have read as well. He wrote El Narco, but he's now written a book about the gun trade. And he really goes into this about how this has massively accelerated murder rates effectively. Yeah. Another myth which takes us to what you're working on at the moment, which definitely is kind of the implication of Narcos, is the DEA are basically kind of good guys, and Narcos does sometimes show them like, making, morally queasy deals with Colombian paramilitaries and so on. But basically, these are the good guys. They are the narrators. It's told through their viewpoint. What do you think of that? I mean, obviously, they're it's yeah. What do you think of it? So right, yeah. Okay. So effectively, yeah. Sorry, my internet is going up and down at the moment. That's fine. We're gonna wait. You're back. Yeah, I'm back. Okay. Right. So effectively, this is one of the kind of last remaining myths of the drug war, right? I mean, we've now had the myth that marijuana causes, whatever, maybe schizophrenia, or if it causes kind of violence. These things have been kind of pulled down. Harm reduction is an enormous wave of really good literature on harm reduction is really showing us that, drug addicts are not necessarily evil people or bad people, but linked to psychological and physical pain, etc., etc. But one of the great myths that still exists, you're absolutely right, is the DEA are the good guys, and they're taking down the really evil people, right? They're not just taking down the street dealers who are desperate. They're not creating mass incarceration. They're taking down Pablo Escobar and Chapo, these mass murdering psychopaths. But I think, as I was trying to explain before, effectively the DEA is kind of creating these mass murdering psychopaths. And one thing that I learned when speaking to DEA agents was, yes, there are a few, mostly who have nice little sweet gigs in Hollywood. So the guy who wrote, or basically wrote Narcos or Narcos Mexico is a James Kirkendall. And he is a big promoter still of the DEA and the DEA's mission.
Oh, I didn't know it was
But most
actually
of them are just
written by
broken.
someone from the DEA.
Most of them are. Well, he's the advisor on
Advisor, yeah,
it.
okay.
Yeah. So, and he's extremely within the DEA. And the other thing you find out is the DEA, they loathe one another. They're enormously critical of one another. I mean, the stories, and I won't go on about this, but there are stories that if you search the net, and maybe if you watch something called The Last Narc, which is about another DEA agent called Hector Berez, there are some stories about Kirkendall that make you question. I shouldn't say, I mean, he's currently suing Hector Berez for the stuff that Hector Berez said about him and narcos. So there's a lot of kind of tension involved. But as I say, a lot of these DEA guys, I mean, they're broken, right? They're mostly, the ones I met were mostly Mexican American, or certainly Latino. And all they've done is basically spend their career putting people who look like them in jail. And some of them go full kind of Trumpist right wing. Some of them go kind of conspiracy theory. Why was I pushed to do this? What bit of the government pushed me to do this? Was this a deep state? A lot of them just drunk, right? I mean, this is not a business to get in if you really want to help. A lot of them, and I think this is one thing that I want to kind of explore in my next book, is so the DEA, as I say, intrinsically does some pretty terrible things. But a lot of the motivation, these people are not dreadful people when they get into it, right? Rather like the drug traffickers themselves. The vast majority of DEA get into it because their brother or their best mate overdosed sometime in the 70s or 80s, right? And they want to stop this. And they do feel they're on a mission, but they also feel what they've done in their 30-year career before they walk into some very nice pension doesn't actually help their dead brother or dead friend.
So we've talked about that the DEA breaks up these kinds of networks of trust, raise the stakes, increase the militarization and the violence. I mean, and the DEA, are they involved in things like torture or disappearances as well?
So, yeah, there is there's a brilliant book called Cops Across Borders, which was written in the 1990s, and it explains effectively how the DEA has a very, very loose remit, right? The military has actually fairly strict rules, often which it infringes, but it has fairly strict rules about engagement. Ditto, the State Department is basically told, get on with capitalists, don't get on with communists, right? It has a fairly strict set of law and a strict set of kind of an administrative internal laws, right? The DEA doesn't. And it basically flits from being a kind of diplomatic arm of the state, which is basically trying to persuade countries to, up drug laws or change its laws on marijuana. But it's also doing investigations. And a lot of these investigations are kind of semi-illegal under these other countries' laws. So in Mexico, it does a lot of stuff which in Mexico actually is entrapment, right? Effectively, it basically goes and pay. I mean, if you're a Mexican, right, earning nothing, and some white guy comes up to you and goes, "Could you get me a kilo of coke? I'll pay you $1,000." Fuck it. That's a life-changing amount of money. I'll ask my mate down the road to do it. And suddenly you're banged in jail. Now that strictly is entrapment. And they do this kind of stuff a lot. Beyond that, this is something, again, I think is very difficult to kind of extricate.
Yeah.
No doubt. And this is partially to do with drug crimes are really, really difficult to prosecute. Let's say you find a field of opium. Who the hell owns that, right? You find an old man buy it. Is he the owner? He says no. He says it's some other bloke, but you've got no idea. So how do you go and basically prosecute him? And the Americans want numbers, right? They want to show you've prosecuted a lot of people. So you basically torture him. Now, is this the DEA is often in the room with the torture? Is it training these people how to torture? But what we do know is that areas in which the DEA has had a lot of influence on drug law enforcement, we know that extricating confessions through torture has gone through the roof. And I think this is something that Mexico is still dealing with today, and they've had multiple legal kind of makeovers and judicial changes. Most confessions for drug crime are extracted through torture, even though there are multiple laws against it. And this started when the DEA got involved in the 70s.
Right. One thing Narcos does show is, it does have the kind of the dark side of the American state, with the CIA occasionally crop up and their deals with, between narco traffickers and the Contras in Nicaragua in the 80s. So you do see that. But in your book, you suggest also, the first series of Narcos Mexico is all about the origin myth of the drugs war, the death of DEA agent Kiki Camarena, and he was tortured and died. And this caused big waves. It was reported, front page of Time magazine, and it really, it seemed like the US took the war on drugs in Mexico much more seriously, or maybe even kicked off the war on drugs. And in Narcos Mexico, the story is that this was the work of, a psycho narco, Rafa Herrera. Who's still on Interpol's most wanted list, and he went crazy, crazy Indian, and then but also with some corrupt, Mexican officials, and this was who killed Kiki. But there are, it's not clear, actually, is it? It's pretty murky, and there are conspiracy theories. And can we know? Or can we question that? Is that narrative questionable, or is it basically it's hard to tell who killed Kiki Camarena?
Yeah, my suspicion is, they basically tortured him a lot, and I suspect people involved in the drug trade, and I suspect that Caro Quintero was there, in the house, and his men were doing this kind of torture. So that's undeniably. Quite why he's tortured, I think, is a big question. What is he tortured because they think that he's that he's discovered that the Mexican state is kind of taking money off drug dealers? Honestly, I doubt it, because they knew that, right? Everyone knew that, right? They've been knowing that since they got there, right? And what the DA does is it chooses certain people to work with and ignores others. So I don't really understand why they would torture him for that.
No.
What they might have tortured him for, and this is what you're speaking about, is I think it is pretty clear that the CIA was using Mexican drug dealers to transport cocaine up to the United States, and then using that money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And I think that is fairly well established. One of the things we do know is there's a 6'7" white man who's really high up in the Guadalajara cartel and is also a CIA agent. That is that's a bit of a giveaway. Right. One of the problems with proving any of this, and this is something I did try to get into this, and this is one, I think it's one where I kind of sold the book. I went to meet Hector Perez, who was the DEA investigating officer who was in his piece, The Last Narc, has really pushed this idea that it was the CIA that ordered the murder of Camarena. The problem is, frankly, and this will mean that I won't get another interview with him, is his techniques, as I think are shown in Narcos season 3, are extremely judicially dodgy. Involve, I suspect, training witnesses. Or this was at least some accusations were made in American. I should be quite careful what I say. But some accusations made in American court that he was basically leading witnesses. And what we definitely do have are loads of witnesses that have remarkably similar versions of what happened 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And they also, this was something that weirded me out, they also all work for his security company. Now, if I had brought a load of drug dealers to court using a load of witnesses who then were meant to go into witness protection, would they then work for the security company of the DEA agent that used them? That seems to me a weird. Up to the point, the CIA agent worked for his security company. It's very, it's so the whole thing's so murky.
Yeah.
So I mean, as I say, I'm pretty sure the CIA was involved, whether it killed him or not. The other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind about the Enrique Camarena thing is DEA agents die all the time, right? They get shot all the time because they're posing as drug dealers. Okay.
Yeah.
So the DEA, when it arrives in Mexico, this is what 1969. It's not the DEA's predecessor arrives. The first head of it has a massive argument with some other guy in the DEA and ends up with his head broken open, drowned on an Acapulco beach the night of this big argument. Bit weird. Another guy takes over. Within 6 months, he dies of a suspected weird heart attack and he's a like 45-year-old man. So these deaths happen all the time. Another one, 1978, there was a guy who was busted he was top mates with a lot of the Mexican policemen. He gets busted for basically giving some cocaine to an informant, and he dies in a Texas prison cell choking on a peanut butter sandwich.
Right.
And they examine his body, and the doctor immediately says, no, he's got strychnine in his body. He's been poisoned. The next doctor says, no, there's absolutely no strychnine. This is total nonsense. He has a nut allergy that had never been picked up.
The point being that DEA agents die all the time, but Kiki's death was perhaps served some kind of purpose, and therefore was a lot of focus and media attention and Washington attention was put on it.
Yeah, because the DEA, I've kind of tried to call it two machines. One, it's the paranoia machines. It creates paranoia within drug narcotic circle, but it's the moral panic machine. And Kiki's death was brilliant for the Reagan era war on drugs because it kind of cleansed the DEA of two things. One, being racist against Mexicans, because Kiki was a Mexican, right? And two, torturing, because he was tortured. So the two kind of key attacks on the DEA. And the DEA in 1985, when this happens, is losing power. It's losing power to customs, it's losing power to the military, it's losing power to local police agencies. It's losing power particularly actually to the FBI. They're thinking of folding the FBI and the DEA together. And Camarena, this case that is, I mean, it's no doubt really unpleasant, but it is blown up to be a huge thing, is a massive, massive benefit for the DEA. And I think is deliberately manipulated by people in the DEA. Right. It's a brilliant piece of propaganda for the drug war.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Mexicans are wrong, but that doesn't mean that all Mexican Americans are bad people. There are good ones, like Kiki.
Okay, well, look, I got last question. Thank you to your family for the use of the Wi-Fi.
Or the neighbours that are stealing.
And then so I'm just curious about the current president of Mexico said he was going to legalize cannabis. What is your perspective on legalization, its prospects in Mexico, and how it might affect the business and the fighting between groups?
In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure it will do a lot of good. I think it will do, it'll do one very simple good that, people for very minor drug infractions will not go to jail. But frankly, they're not really going to jail that much at the moment, right? So effectively, and it will stop some of the kind of street fights over marijuana, right? I think that's obviously a good thing. So some of those kind of, fights in Tijuana and these big cities over kind of street sales, that will go down. But unless you legalize, frankly, meth and crack and heroin, it's a drop in the ocean, really. Yeah. Mexico has not had the kind of mass incarceration of low-level weed smokers like the United States. So I think it's a drop in the ocean in terms of incarcerating people. It might kind of help the corner wars. What it's not going to help are two things. One, it's not going to help the people who are smoking weed or taking these other drugs because they are in deep psychological and physical pain. And what you really need, and what America needs, is proper social services that deal with both of these things, right? It is no coincidence that Britain, where effectively, due to the pandemic and chronic underfunding, the NHS is going through a serious crisis point. And if you've ever tried to get, an appointment for any kind of psychological care in the NHS, it's basically fucking impossible. But it's no coincidence that we are now going through our own addiction and overdose crisis, right? Was it 5,000 dead last year? I mean, that's a hell of a lot. So I think that and just legalizing weed is not going to help that massive hole in social services, which is why people take drugs. The second thing that is problematic is you're going to have to grow this weed somewhere, and out in these places there is no police, there's very little army presence, and as a result, you're still going to have fights over the land on which is the very valuable land on which this weed is grown. Right, the same way that coffee was legal. Coffee's always been legal, but during the 50s and 60s, Mexico had these incredibly bloody coffee wars because coffee became a really valuable product, and little villages fought one another for the land you could grow coffee on. And marijuana is really similar to coffee. You don't have to grow it on good land. You can grow it on crap land, and this crap land is often between two warring villages that then fight brutal wars, really bloody wars, now with nice American guns, over who basically, gets the money from this marijuana. So I have a horrible feeling that it might actually create its own problems.
And then there's the other issue that you mentioned earlier about this isn't just about drugs anymore. Gangs are, that drugs are a diminishing part of their overall profit structure, and it's extortion, it's human trafficking, and so forth.
Right. So they're extorting the local bloke who sells cigarettes in his store, right? Well, they're just going to, as soon as he's selling marijuana cigarettes, they'll extort him for that.
Avocado is illegal, and they're still, just to kind of comparatively, like, I went to Colombia last month, and you go to Medellin, and they talk about what a success story it is, and it does. The homicide rate has gone down. You can visit barrios, and it's like going to Portobello Market now, and it's the gangsters are now selling craft beer, so I mean, are there any kind of comparative examples in Latin America where things have got better and that could be hopeful? I mean, what can we draw hope from the Colombia experience, for the example of Colombia for Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, yes, in some ways, right? And I'm glad you've asked me that, because I always end these talks or these interviews incredibly depressingly. Go, there's no hope, right. But you're absolutely right. They've effectively made deals with the major players in Colombia. They protect them. Colombia still is a kind of major transport route for narcotics. It also produces a lot in form of FARC areas. But you're absolutely right in saying that homicide rates have decreased, particularly in some of the kind of transport routes like Medellin, basically because they made, and Cali, right? They made deals, particularly in Cali. They effectively said, you can have 5 years in prison. We're not going to totally ruin you. You can keep your money. You can put it into banks, but please stop really ostentatiously trafficking vast quantities of coke.
Yeah.
I think where Mexico has a bit of a problem is that it's three things. It's a bit like Colombia in that it produces a bit of drugs and transports it, but it's also the place, it's basically on the American border. So it's also the place that all the Americans go to get high. It also has a massive drug problem itself. These are things that are quite much more difficult to sort out than just being a trafficking hub, right? So you might be able to make Culiacan a kind of Medellin, right? I actually think you might be, in actual fact, Culiacan, oddly, it's not, I mean, it's got a bit of narco culture, but it's not a particularly dangerous place to be in, right? Having said that, I got a bit scared there, but I mean, it has relatively low homicide rates compared to other cities, right? So I think you could make Culiacan into a craft beer, groovy narco culture play. I really do think there is a kind of opportunity, and it kind of is actually. I mean, if you're
and the Median success story, they also they invested quite a lot in social projects. They tried to create alternatives to joining gangs,
right?
For young people.
Yeah, so that's really crucial. As you know, basically all violence in the world is done by men between the ages of 16 and 30. And you've actually got to give them opportunities, and you've got to give them funding in education and in work. And that's something that Medellin did really well. Plus, they did these kind of big infrastructure projects, which, the famous cable car. They also had some really clever ideas about kind of urban geography, bringing the barrios close to the center. All of these things were just fantastic ideas, and I think really could benefit places like Culiacan, or maybe even like Guadalajara, which are kind of trafficking centers. Whether you can do that with Tijuana or Juarez, which rely on a vice economy, whether you can do that with villages that rely on basically cooking up meth, that I'm slightly less, that I find, that's more difficult, I think.
Maybe there's a shift in the American kind of war on drugs, and as they get more legalized in the US, there's less need to go to, Cancun to get high, because you can get high in Miami or whatever, legally as well. And so I don't know, again, like looking for possible kind of grains of hope.
Well, I mean, as I say, I think you're right. I think that is hopeful. So without the drug money, you're not supercharging criminal organizations, but they have now got their claws into so many other businesses. That's what really, I mean, this is okay. I'll end it here. I can end with a really my formal depressing story. But I deal a lot with refugees who are escaping Mexico, and a lot of them come from areas where previously they're growing drugs, and now the cartels have moved into other industries, so avocado growing areas, etc. Michoacan, Guerrero, Oaxaca. But I suddenly got a flood of people from Chiapas. Now, Chiapas is entirely indigenous.
When you say what do you mean? Because you're acting as a defendant in their cases.
I act as an expert witness for lawyers who are representing them and trying to get them refugee status in the United States. And I kind of always thought Chiapas was a kind of indigenous zone that was fairly immune to these kind of floods of capital, really, that are kind of destroying villages. But it transpires there is now effectively, and they call it a cartel, but there is an organized crime group that speaks Tzotzil Mayan, which basically controls contraband going up from Guatemala to southern Mexico. Now that contraband, some of it's drugs, most of it's Central American and Haitian migrants. A lot of it's, this is really sad, but a lot of it is sex trafficking. A lot of it is kidnapping young girls and forcing them to sex trafficking. I mean, it's a really, really bleak. And that kind of thing, I'm not quite sure how to solve. But then I think maybe being involved in these kind of expert witness cases is perhaps not good training for positive. You don't get people who run away going, I'm running away from my craft beer business that I made with some drug money and my nice city. Refugees aren't fleeing because they're happy, right? So maybe I get a slightly...
No, but you make a point at the beginning of your book that the moral panic around bad hombres and evil Mexican narcos is a great excuse to ship people back to Mexico. So it's tied in with the war on immigration as well.
And mass incarceration. So I mean, the DEA and the FBI is always doing these very well publicized captures of cartel members that allegedly are in the United States. So they'll round up 300 members of the cartel Jalisco. But I've dealt as an expert witness for some of these people who are allegedly Ohio's head of the cartel Jalisco. They're 18-year-old boys. And they're mostly complete, and they've got like 30 years in jail as part of what they do, which is a kind of RICO conspiracy thing, saying you're part of a cartel. But these guys were, the one I dealt with, he was, I won't mention the state or who he is, but he was allegedly kidnapped somebody, but he kidnapped somebody because this thug threatened to murder his entire family. And he had nowhere to hold the person, so he held him in the janitor's closet of his local high school.
He's got 50 years in jail as a cartel Jalisco mastermind.
Yeah.
I can tell you, he ain't.
Yeah. Oh, Ben, thanks so much. It's fascinating. I mean, you know so much about it, and I think your next book sounds like it's going to be fascinating as well. So, The Dope by Benjamin Smith. It came out a year ago. It looks like it's doing brilliantly. So, nice one. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for your time, man.
Cheers. Well, thank you very much. That was really, really enjoyable. I really appreciate it. And I'll let my kids get back to rotting their mind through social media.
All right,
another drug.
Yeah. Okay. Good to see you.
All right, mate. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.